It's an immigration issue.
Spiritual issue.
A feminist issue.
A right now issue.
It's the ultimate intersectional justice issue.
I'm determined to be part of the solution because
I want there to be children on this planet in 7 generations.
Because everyone has a role to play.
Because it's the right thing to do.
It's easy to imagine a future that is bleak.
I can also imagine transformation.
People rising in resilience.
100% clean energy.
Farms that sequester carbon in their soil.
A world that is inclusive.
A future that works for all of us.
I am a woman.
I'm a woman.
I am leading on climate.
We are leading on climate.
Join us. Join us.
Welcome to Climate Action News, brought to you by We Don't Have Time, the social network for climate solutions, in collaboration with Earth Day Network, Our Kids Climate, and Plan International. This show is viewed by people in 55 countries, which of course makes us very happy. The show is broadcasted once a month with an after show 2 weeks later. My name is Catarina Rolfsdotter Jansson, and I am the program host of this show. If you want to be the part of the solution of the climate crisis, please download the We Don't Have Time app and interact with the guests on this show. They'll be ready for you and can also be chatted with until 8:30 Central European Standard Time tonight. So thank you for joining us. With us now we have 3 guests that I'd like to introduce. Please meet Nick Nuttall from Berlin. Nick is the Director of Strategic Communications from Earth Day. Hello there, Nick. Great to have you with us again. And with us from New York, Jill Kubit. She's co-founder of Our Kids Climate. Hi there, Jill. And with us from from Washington, D.C., Dr. Sweta Chakraborty. Sweta, you are a risk behavioral scientist and also the U.S. representative for We Don't Have Time. So Sweta, would you like to start giving us what's going on globally in terms of climate news?
Yeah, absolutely. So the news that really shook us and the climate community is the Chilean president canceling COP25 next month. We heard this news that amidst ongoing violent protests, 20 people have been left dead, and this has really sent shockwaves through Latin America. So President Piñera made the announcement last week, and world leaders that were expected to be there, including our President Trump and China's Xi Jinping, will not be going now to Chile. And then activist Greta Thunberg, who is also aiming to attend, is instead looking to see how she can make it to the new location of Madrid. She's currently still in North America, and as we know, as a climate community, she's opposed to flying. This sudden shift is going to be undoubtedly difficult for critical participants, especially delegates in the Southern Hemisphere. So we need to watch this closely to see how COP25 goes this year. Here in America also, the California wildfires have been raging. Now we know that climate change is increasing the frequency and intensity of wildfires out in the west of the United States, and 18 million Americans are threatened by these fires. But in the meantime, of course, President Trump is finding everyone to blame but the reality of the truth behind climate change. The state's Democratic governor has come under fire, forest management and state water policies. Trump has even reduced federal aid and continues to threaten to slash funding. And we know that these fires are going to increase and become not just seasonal, but all year round. So this is also a news story we need to keep our eye on and follow closely. The third story I want to share is the ExxonMobil suing case, where Rex Tillerson testified last week. So we're moving from California to New York now. An industry giant is being sued for shareholder fraud, and the former chief executive of ExxonMobil, and also he was Trump's Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, took the stand and disputed the allegations that ExxonMobil knowingly lied about its efforts to take the potential cost of climate change on its business into account. And this was accused deception to shareholders, and this allegedly occurred under Tillerson's reign. So it's important as a community to follow this case because it's going to set the precedent for future accountability by the private sector. And then a new report came out that showed we're actually underestimating carbon emissions from tropical forest loss. So Reuters found that the amount of planet warming carbon emitted from the world's tropical forests have been underreported, mainly because the longer term effects of tree destruction haven't been taken into account. This is sad news for us. This means this new factor increases emissions by 6 times in regards to tropical forest loss. And the final news story I'd like to share is on the Keystone XL pipeline. This has been a controversy in the States for years at this point. The Obama administration ended the pipeline plans. The purpose was to carry tar sands oil from Canada to Nebraska. And there's been a lot of opposition to the pipeline, mainly because of the environmental disaster that it's causing. Trump revived the pipeline via presidential permit. So even just a few days ago was the second leak in 2 years. 9,000 barrels of oil leaked in North Dakota, and that's enough to fill up half of an Olympic-sized swimming pool. The company that oversees the pipeline has yet to determine what caused the leak. But we need to pay close attention because this is literally the second time in 2 years. Those are my top stories that I'd like to share with the community. Thank you.
Thank you, Sweta. Would you say that there is more focus and more room, space in American media to climate news?
Yeah, I'm definitely noticing that. It's also because the elections are coming up, and all the Democratic candidates have released their plans at this point, their climate policy plans. And so it's making a lot of these different issues are making the headlines as it relates to the elections and how the candidates compare to one another. So it's a good time in that sense because the politics of climate change is coming to the forefront of conversation.
And all of these pieces of news that you selected, of course, you can find on the We Don't Have Time platform. Looking at social media, what would you say in the United States in that realm of social media? How is the tonality? Is it shifting in terms of more interest and more focus on climate action?
Yeah, I think definitely we're seeing trends towards sharing and awareness, and so it is a global concern. There's not any single one of these impacts does not stay within state borders. And so what we're seeing in California, you see replicated in Brazil with the burning of the Amazon. So it's this increasing awareness and sharing of various impacts for those who are closest to experiencing them. I definitely, as a behavioral scientist, am seeing it's harder and harder for those to disengage or to say that something is too overwhelming to process because really it's getting to the point where it's affecting everybody. Nobody is immune to it, and you're not safe regardless of what state or what nation you are a citizen of. And so that is then being replicated in social media. You're seeing that awareness also being shared.
Which is hopeful. Thank you very much, Sweta. And Jill from New York, Our Kids Climate co-founder, what news would you like to highlight?
So building off what was just discussed, that there's this increased awareness in terms of the news coverage and in terms of increased activism. There's also increase in climate impacts. One thing I wanted to discuss is the idea of eco-anxiety. As we've seen climate change become more important and more discussed, we're also seeing a rise in people's concern and people being worried. And so in the most recent survey by Yale and George Mason, they found the highest numbers of concerned or worried people in the United States, saying that 69% of people are somewhat worried and 29% are very worried. And so this article that I'm sharing really discusses what people can do who are increasingly concerned or worried about climate change. And they give 3 ideas. The first is to become a climate advocate. And this is making meaningful change either in your life or at the political level. And so some of the examples that they gave in the article are making smart food choices and transportation choices, but also becoming an advocate and promoting policy and also thinking about climate in the voting booth. And so the most important point here is to become more actively engaged and involved. The second recommendation that they give is to become, to do these actions with other people. There's this idea that when we do things with our friends or we do things in groups, that we actually see ourselves and our own individual actions as being more important because they're connected to others. And then the third recommendation is to focus on this idea that we can make progress and really think about what we would like the future to look like. And so that's really what I wanted to share. And we're seeing this not just kind of in the news and the discussion around eco-anxiety. We're actually seeing this in the parent movement, where a lot of teachers and parents are coming to us, asking us for resources and materials on, how to address eco-anxiety within children and how to talk about climate change in a way that does not scare kids. So I see this as a really important issue in the next month and next years.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jill. Any comments from Nick or Sweta on this? Please, Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's hats off to the Spanish government for very much stepping in at the last minute to actually host COP25 in Madrid after Chile decided that they couldn't do it. Because, actually organizing a COP is a hell of a business. I mean, 25,000 people, 30,000 people. Paris was 45,000 people in 2015. So how they pulled it off, I don't know, but they seem to be keeping this particular show on the road. And I think we all have to be very grateful, because 2019 is the staging post for the big year 2020. And decisions have to be taken in Madrid that will have echo into 2020 and hopefully lead to a good outcome of more countries stepping up their climate ambition.
Nick, for those of the viewers that might not be familiar with the exceptional year 2020, would you like to highlight that?
Well, 2020 was supposed to be the year where the global emissions were going to peak, everywhere on average across the globe, but that's not going to happen. But the 2020 is the year when the window opens for governments to start putting their what they call enhanced nationally determined contributions, their enhanced national climate plans on the table to get the world better on track with the Paris climate change agreement. So this is a big window opening in 2020, and of course the UK will be hosting the climate COP in Glasgow in Scotland. And the UN Secretary General had this summit in September, and a number of countries did in fact commit to actually increasing their ambition. Most of the big emitters didn't, but I think we're going to start seeing some of the bigger countries coming through. And Hilda Hein of the Marshall Islands, who is a big player in the whole area of climate change, has actually asked that they put down these enhanced national climate action plans by April 22nd, 2020, which is Earth Day.
Thank you. Sweta, when you hear Jill's the story she chose to highlight about the actions points that people could actually take, and also the worry from the school teachers, what kind of bell does that ring for you?
Yeah, I think the point that she made about people feeling that group action is much more effective than individual action is just nail on the head. The issue with climate change, the way I look at it and study it as a behavioral scientist, is that fear is attention catching, and it gets the attention and that we need to highlight the devastation that is inevitable if we don't move now and proactively really manage these different risks that are affiliated with the planet warming. And so while fear will get your attention, it won't mobilize you to act. And then as an individual, you think, what is the point of me doing anything? I'm just a drop in the bucket. This is complex, interconnected, overwhelming. And so the hope that comes is what actually motivates action. And that's what we study as behavioral scientists in this space, is how do you combine efforts, create collaboration, create group effort, and that hope that is then generated can actually see some progress happen and see the needle move towards actual proactive risk management, which is going to be so critical.
Thank you. Over to you, Nick, and also it's time for you to share your news.
Yeah, I was just going to quickly come back and just one thing about this issue of emotional reaction to climate change. Fear is one thing. You also talked, I think, Jill, a bit about anxiety as well. I mean, we know that there is some research in some of the northern countries where the ice is disappearing, where the snows are less frequent, the Nordic countries, the Arctic residents, of a sadness at losing what is deemed to be a cultural heritage. So it's a very complex issue, this of the emotional reaction to climate change. What did I want to point out in the news? Well, I wanted to point out this rather fun story. It's fun on one level, but it has a serious point, which is the world was actually captured by watching this lighthouse in Denmark being moved on this little railway type track from being on the edge of the cliffs, where it was in danger of being washed into the sea as a result of erosion, sort of further inland. And when you look at it, it was a very cute thing of a community coming together to save a piece of cultural heritage. But it has a bigger point, which is we often talk about how we have to reduce emissions, but there's another aspect to the climate change story, which is how the devil are we going to climate proof all this infrastructure around the world, particularly on the coastlines and particularly in river systems. I mean, I just checked out, there's something called the Lighthouse Directory, can you believe? There are 18,600 lighthouses in the world. Are we going to move them all? And that's just a small thing in the bucket. I mean, there's something like the C40 cities estimate 570 low-lying cities around the world. You know, Guangzhou, Alexandria in Egypt, New Orleans in the USA, I mean, wherever you look, that by mid-century will have witnessed a 0.5 meter in sea level rise. Now, we're talking about power lines, we're talking about road structures, we're talking about hospitals, we're talking about all the infrastructure you can think of at risk. Now, the best way to adapt, of course, is to actually reduce emissions. But the world has already signed itself up to some measure of climate change. We need to start investing in climate proofing our infrastructure, or else we're going to be in for a very, very nasty shock indeed.
For sure, for sure. You have another piece of news that you'd like to share too with us, Nick?
Well, there was obviously a little bit of news yesterday about a certain president in a developed country pulling that country out of the Paris Agreement. I mean, no big surprise there, right? I mean, I was in Marrakesh in Morocco the year after the Paris summit when Trump was elected. Everybody was very miserable for about 30 minutes. Then all the countries came together and said, no, we're going to do this anyway, with or without the US. So it's just confirmation of what he had already said he was going to do. But I think when you see the reaction from the cities and the states in the United States, how private businesses and many organizations are willing to try and pick up the slack from the Trump administration's decision, this is very inspiring. But where I really worry is the support that the United States needs to give to the developing countries to help them get on track with climate change through things like the Green Climate Fund and other places. This is where I think there's going to be a terrible impact from the decision.
Well, the fund is still lacking the promised money from many governments. So there is a lack of funding for sure.
Yeah, but I think definitely in the United States, this is where the hammer may hit hardest,
of course,
in terms of the impacts of Trump pulling out.
Jill, please.
Just a quick question to any of you. I mean, you know, I've been reading about the U.S. Pulling out of the agreement too, and I'm just wondering about where we see the leadership stepping in, and you know, because obviously if the U.S. comes out, there has to be more progress in other places. So I don't know if either of you have insight into where you think you're going to really see countries leading around, maybe China or India, Europe. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, so in The Guardian today, talking
COP25.
about Trump pulling out, there's also Macron of France and the head of state of China are meeting on Wednesday, and they're going to sign a statement which is called, I think I'm going to mention, irreversibility. In other words, you cannot change this trajectory that the world is on, which is to fight climate change. So you're seeing an alliance between the French and the Chinese. I mean, the great success of Paris was the former US administration, Obama, and the Chinese coming together. People always say that China needs a partner in this combating climate change. Perhaps the European Union, led by France, will actually pick up the slack on this. So I think you're going to see it there. But I think in the United States, you're seeing amazing leadership in, you know, states like California, cities like New York and Seattle and Washington, and all kinds of places, and the private sector too. I mean, all the evidence that has been in front of this current administration is that climate change is bad news for pulling out of Paris is not good news for the economy. Coal's on its way out anyway because it's no longer competitive. So Trump's idea that he would bring back coal is, you know, a bit of a laugh really, because even the coal museum in Kentucky is powered by solar power these days because it's more efficient and better than using coal. So
what an irony,
it's a political decision, right? It's not an economic decision. It defies logic on any other grounds, and this is what he wanted to do. It's just politics. I'm a big boy, and he's pulling us out of the Paris Agreement.
Sweta.
I also see the alternative leadership is really stepping up, which gives a lot of hope. Nothing can replace governance at the highest level. But that being said, what you both of my colleagues here are saying is exactly accurate. We saw the C40 Cities Summit take place in Copenhagen last month. That's mayors from all over the world coming together and talking about what they can do at the local levels to really pick up where global leadership is lacking. We saw the Green Climate Fund meet last week, and there's something like 19 trillion in assets there of the CEOs that came together to meet in Paris, talking about how the private sector can really step up and invest. And so there's projects that wouldn't be getting off the ground if it wasn't for support from private sector, from local leaders, state leaders, and that actually will make up as long as they keep going and they have the continued support of the public, that'll make up for the lack of US leadership for the moment. And we're really sitting tight, and it's going to be critical that the administration shifts to a more environmental steward policy administration in the future. Otherwise, yeah, it is very scary what would happen if we had 4 more years of somebody like President Trump.
Thank you. Before we finish this section, I'd like each of you to conclude just with a few sentences your hopes for the COP. Jill, would you like to start?
I mean, I really think the citizen activism around the COP is, for me, probably the most important thing. So really seeing not necessarily like inside the negotiations, but what happens externally, and what happens with the student strikes, and with adults really like paying attention. I think that to me is my most important hope.
Thank you. Nick.
Thank you. So we've got about 70 countries so far that have agreed to actually enhance their national climate action plans by 2020. And it would be good to see some bigger emitters signal that in Madrid. And I'd also like to see governments coming behind the idea of citizens' assemblies in which people of the public, youth, and older people can play a part in each country's decision-making process on climate change.
Thank you. Shuta.
I would like to see similar to what Jill said, what is going on from those who aren't necessarily traditionally holding power, but the influence that they're exerting and the attention that they're getting through social media, like youth activists, like Greta Thunberg. I am so impressed with the ability for them to be able to get a message out in a compelling way. It's that narrative that really reaches people and really brings that hope that then incites movement and action. And then We Don't Have Time is the perfect platform. This isn't even a plug. It's just incredible that we're giving this technology that is going to be necessary to get those voices, those alternative voices that wouldn't necessarily have that ability to get their message out. We're giving them that tool to do that. So I'm really looking forward to see how technology is harnessed and utilized, and how young communicators take full advantage of it.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Well, thank you, all 3 of you, for participating in the show again. And let's keep our fingers crossed and for the great success for COP25. And the next show will be on again on December 18th. Great. Thank you so much. We no longer talk about climate change as a future abstract threat. We are in a climate crisis. And we are connecting this deeply to our lives and to our deeds. Children are going on strikes. Politicians are imposing stricter legislation, and some professionals are quitting their jobs to work full-time with climate action. And also, social media is starting to become a platform for the transition to a safer climate position on our planet than just as an instigator for more consumption. Remarkably often, the leading voices in this are women. They're female voices. Today, we will explore how women lead the way towards a new paradigm in courage, in climate courage, and crisis communications. Let me introduce the guests of this episode. With us here, we have Katharine Wilkinson, author and vice president, the Drawdown, Project Drawdown, and she's with us from Atlanta, Georgia. Hi there, Katharine. How are you? And also with us, we have Anne-Birgitte Albrechtsen, she's global CEO of Plan International, and she's with us from Walking the United Kingdom. And next to me here in the studio, I have Jakob Trollbäck. Jakob is founder of the New Division and also of the Trollbäck company in New York, and the creator of the Sustainable Development Goals, the design of them for the United Nations. And Nick Nuttall from Earth Day Network with us from Berlin. Great to have all of you here. Great to be joining us. Katharine, could you please start by telling us a bit more about Project Drawdown, please?
Sure, I'd love to. So science has made very clear that we have this great transformation ahead of us. And that begs the question I think many of us are grappling with, which is, well, what are our tools to get there? What are our tools for building a climate-safe future? And that is really what the work of Project Drawdown is about. We are a nonprofit organization that tries to create a resource about climate solutions for the world. to bring together the incredible collective wisdom that humanity has about practices and technologies that can actually help us reach the point of drawdown, the point where we're pulling more greenhouse gases down than we're sending up, and ultimately bring us to a climate-safe future.
Thank you, Katharine. Could you tell us a bit more about your TED Talk and the response to that?
Sure. I had the chance to speak at TED Women last year and talk about the intersection of gender and climate and women's leadership. And I think it's helpful to think about kind of three key areas in what is a very complicated nexus. One that we probably hear about the most is that climate change can deepen gender inequality, right? Because it is a threat multiplier where there are existing challenges or vulnerabilities or inequities. Those are all potentially, and we're already seeing it, deepened by the impacts of climate change. The second area that we hear less about, and we really tried to shine a light on in our work at Project Drawdown, is that gender equality is itself a climate solution. So there are critical areas around the rights of all girls and women to education, to high quality voluntary reproductive health care that end up having also positive ripple effects for the planet, in addition to all the many other goods that they create for individual lives, for families, for communities, and beyond. And then the third area, and I'm so excited that we're going to talk about this today, is that we are seeing women and girls step forward in, I think, really catalytic and transformational leadership in the climate movement. And it's not a surprise, right? When you are closer to the impact, when you're closer to the problem, you are necessarily closer to the solutions. And we're seeing this great courage and imagination about the world that we want to create together.
Thank you, Katharine. Anne-Birgitte, as the CEO of Plan International, you worked a lot with gender equality. And you work very strongly now with the focus on resilient communities. What would you say are your key findings for getting women and also men involved in creating more resilient communities?
Hi, and it's great to be here. But so Plan International works in thousands of the poorest communities in the world. And it's probably worth just pointing out that the communities that we work in are already feeling the climate crisis. This is not a distant future. They are seeing more adverse weather events that are impacting schooling, jobs, health facilities, access to natural resources. The other thing that's probably worth pointing out at this stage is that the first responders, when you're faced with a crisis, are always the local communities. It's always local. We think of, the humanitarians flying in and saving lives. Ultimately, the life-saving first actions are always local. They're always your neighbor. They're always the friends around you. So getting local communities engaged in climate resilience, community resilience, school resilience, health facilities resilience is actually not a big challenge, because once you've experienced the crisis, first of all, you have yourself become a lot more resilient, but you also want to build back better and build for the future. So we see both boys and girls, young men, young women, and their parents, teachers, and others really driving community resilience now.
But you've done a lot of research in Plan International. I've followed your work for many years now. And when it comes to gender in crisis, what would you say to really get people engaged in the crisis situation? Could you dig a bit deeper into that, please?
Yeah, well, Katharine has mentioned the overarching elements of that, but let me try and bring it to life a little bit. So I was wanting to share with you a very specific example of how girls and women are affected by climate change. I visited Mozambique in May, shortly after they had been hit by 2 successive cyclones, the first time in their history where they had been hit twice within a few weeks. And for a girl living in a village that may be going to school, normally her day consists of fetching water for 2 hours every day, in the morning before she goes to school and after school. After these cyclones, the girls in the village I visited were now spending 6 hours a day fetching water, which of course means that they've dropped out of school. It means that they have longer to go for water where they're more unsafe and where sexual harassment and abuse and other things can occur. And generally, we're seeing that in community after community, that those that are hardest affected by climate change and by adverse weather effects and crisis is the girl child and the adolescent girl.
Thank you, Anne-Birgitte. Jakob, with me here in Stockholm in the studio, you're a mastermind of communications, having created the SDGs wonderful platform, basically a language for 7 billion people. What would you say is the key to successful communication when it comes to involving people in a topic, in a field that really doesn't really benefit only themselves? Because this is what we're facing, right? We need to move away from the egoism and look further to the next of kin and even further.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to talk about communication. But the first thing that we always start with is to just state that information is not communication. There's a lot of communication, information out there. But to make it into communication, you have to understand a couple of things. And one thing is that it has to have an understanding factor in it. So first you have to make the information understandable, but that's not enough, because if you want to reach a large group of people, then you also have to make it interesting, because we can't learn anything that we're not interested in. So you always have to find a language that is appealing, that is easy to understand, and you can connect it with your interest and what you're passionate about. And I mean, ironically, I would say, because I spent 20 years of my life in advertising, this is really what advertising is really good at. They're cutting away everything that's not essential, and then they're lifting up one simple message. Then, you know, I also have to say that obviously that message is a message that's not a sustainable message when it comes to advertising. So that's why I find it so interesting to tackle the world's most important questions with the same thinking that in some ways starts not with what I want to say, but with what I can communicate. So you're turning the communication around, and you're thinking about what you're doing as if you were the receiver of the communication.
When you look around in your daily job, traveling or whatnot, you see the goals everywhere and you see how people work with them. How does that what feedback do you get from the communication of this urgent plan?
Well, I think that the most interesting thing and the greatest thing that I didn't quite understand in the beginning of the project was that we have made sort of a map of all the problems in the world. That makes it easier to start to think about them one by one. And I think before the goals, it was much more like, there's too many problems everywhere. What can we do about it? But now we all of a sudden have it very nicely packaged. These are related, these are the same. And I think it's a very comprehensive map over it.
For sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. Nick, you have worked for many, many years as a communication strategist, and you're also a former colleague to Ms. Christiana Figueres. Would you say that there is a momentum now with women, especially young women, raising their voices in terms of facing the climate challenge? And how could we benefit from this?
No, I think there is a real momentum here, and I think the role of women in the issue of, say, climate change and sustainability is coming more and more to the fore. But there's still some really horrendous what might say even, stupid things going on, still persisting in many countries. I mean, the fact that something like, women have very little access to land tenure, yet they're also very important, particularly in developing countries, for the agricultural side of things. I mean, we know when there are disasters in places like Africa, the men often leave the villages and the small communities and go off to the cities to try and find work, leaving the women on their own. Yet often the women don't have access to the land like they should do. And even things like, I mean, there's lots of evidence, that women are absolutely fantastic with things like solar power. And, you have organizations or companies like the Solar Sisters in Africa bringing solar power to communities through a kind of door-to-door selling operation of solar units. Yet many women can't get access to bank accounts. They can't get the basic funding through the normal mechanisms that men have access to, even though they're clearly absolutely brilliant at actually getting things like solar power systems into communities. So we're going to have to deal with these. I mean, I know everyone's aware of it, and we know that some of the financing flows under the UN system and things like that are trying to address these issues, but we need to move much faster and at scale. Mm-hmm. And I just say one last point. I was just looking at a piece of research. I mean, this is not just about developing country women. This is about developed country women. A fantastic report by CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project. We had Paul Dickinson on the show a few weeks ago, of if you have 3 women on the board of a company, and this is a survey from India, but applies to all countries, you are far more likely as a company to disclose your carbon footprint, which is absolutely the first step towards actually getting on board and managing down your company's emissions. So, it's clear that the women's role stretches far beyond just the developing countries and the developed countries. It's everywhere where they can make a difference to this challenge of climate change and sustainability.
So, Anne-Birgitte, what Nick just said about there's so much power to unleash in the women, and especially, well, not only, but especially developing countries. What can you say from your perspective from working with Plan for such a long time?
So the biggest barrier that girls and young women face in terms of activism and engagement and leadership is that they are rarely invited to the table, whether that's in the corporate world or whether that's in local or national politics. So our experience is that a lot more needs to be done to make sure that the doors are open so they can be heard. And not just so that their problems can be explained to politicians, but also so that they can be part of co-designing solutions.
Thank you. Jakob, you were on a stage just about a month ago when I was a moderator, and you talked about, well, you actually said in the concluding panel, you said, where are all the men? Talking about sustainable development and specifically climate action. Would you like to elaborate on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's when you're looking at progressive forces, wherever it is, and if you look at cultural forces in society, and if you look at forces for equality, there you very often hear female voices behind it. And I mean, I think that it depends. It's because men and women, and in a sense, I hate making these categorizations, but if you would say something that can be generally true, that I find is generally true, is that men often work for their own prestige, their own benefit, and then if they manage to start a good company, it's because that's something that's going to empower them in some way. I think that women has another mindset where they're thinking that we want to create solutions, and if I do a good solution, then maybe I get some credit for it. But I think it's a slight shift, but the question is, if you think about the work you're doing first and yourself second, as a recipient of or instigator or something, because we all like to get credits for things. But I think men are very often, from day one, they have a target that is like, I'm going to be famous, I'm going to be richest, best, strongest, most powerful. And that's clearly something that's not a sustainable way of driving businesses or thinking about problems in the world at all.
What do you say, the rest of you, about this? Katharine?
Well, I think there's a really important point here, that there's a subtle but significant difference between a focus on making change or a focus on being in charge. And I think when you get the focus on being in charge out of the way, you begin to see more capacity for collaboration, for building community, which is the necessary first step to building power. I think there's something really powerful that's happening with a lot of women and girls that I'm sort of watching in the movement, which is showing up with more of their whole selves, right? With the grief, the fear, the anger, the courage, the determination, the uncertainty, all of these things, and coming from heart-centered leadership as much as they are coming from head-centered leadership. And I think it's in that intersection, that's incredibly powerful. And I loved actually that recently Don Cheadle and Mark Ruffalo wrote a piece about feminist leadership, women's leadership on climate, but they said this one line I loved, that feminine leadership creates space for all of us to lead, and any of us can exhibit its qualities. So, the idea that regardless of gender orientation, we can show up with more sort of faithfully feminist leadership and tapping into what we would consider kind of more conventionally feminine qualities, or even the sacred feminine.
Nick, do you agree?
Thank you. Yes. I mean, I hate to fall into traps and stereotypes, but I think sometimes it's worth listening to women's voices. And I think that, when you listen to some of these entrepreneurs, which I mentioned, like the Solar Sisters in Africa, they don't just see this as a business, this solar selling of solar instruments. They get the climate change angle too, but they also see it as an opportunity for children to actually be educated and learn in the evening. And I think there just seems to be, and again, let's not generalize all over the place, but I think generally women kind of see slightly the bigger picture, and they also see others benefiting from whatever they're doing, whereas I think men can be a bit more tunnel vision. So I would say that. I just want to make one other point, which was our friend from Plan International talking about the importance of, girls and young women being listened to by their leaders, whether they be men or women. But there is a problem here, right? Because also in many countries, politically, in the parliaments and the governments, women are still underrepresented. So again, the system is kind of loaded against the rapid advancement of this huge potential which women and girls represent for helping us on climate change and many, many other issues.
So how do we move this along? How do we break open the walls so there are more female leaders and more feminine energy, regardless of gender, really? What do you say?
You're asking me?
Yeah, I'm asking all of you.
Well, I just think that, there are lots of targets out there. There are lots of people that are aware that we need to increase the numbers of women in boardrooms, in government, in all kinds of different places. I see that in the Financial Times the other day that the 30% movement had achieved some kind of target there, a goal to actually get 30% of women, I think it's in boardrooms. But again, they're not right at the top, right? They're normally 30% in the companies, but they're not right at the top again. So we need to keep pushing, we need to keep moving. But I think unlocking, whether it be bank accounts in developing countries or land tenure for women, or whether by demonstrating as well, like the survey we've just seen, which is that, if you have 3 women on a board, they actually get climate change much better and the company actually responds much better, is that also evidence-based. And I would get back to the McKinsey report, which I know my colleagues all know, but if women had the full opportunity to work like men do, right, then that could be a 20% benefit to GDP, $28 trillion, more than enough money to deal with climate change. So I think it's all in all our interests, male and female, to have more female in the mix of our companies and our societies making decisions. Yeah.
So it sounds like we need to connect the dots more, the threat connected to the possibilities, and really there is such a dramatic change, possible change if we let more women out in the field to really do their thing. Anne-Birgitte.
Yeah, we just did a study together with the Gina Davis Institute on young women's view on leadership. And the phenomenally exciting finding is that over 80% of girls and young women in developed and developing countries actually want to lead. And they also have confidence in themselves that they can make a real contribution. They want to lead differently, as some of our colleagues have said, use feminist leadership principles, be more solution seekers than problem solvers, mobilize people around them. But what's holding them back was another consistent message, which is really frightening, and that we're actually seeing here in the UK as they're beginning to mobilize for a new election. And that is that women don't want to stand for leadership positions or elections because they are afraid of the rest of us. They're afraid that they'll be belittled. They're afraid that they'll be harassed. The increased online hate, harassment and abuse that takes place in all kinds of countries and societies is moving the needle the wrong way. So while we've seen some progress in political leadership, corporate leadership, etc., it's that sort of toxic environment that women step into that's holding young women back from engaging in leadership positions. And until we've tackled that, I don't see us moving the needle very far.
This is, of course, extremely problematic. Katharine?
I just wanted to reiterate, I think, what AB is saying. Recognizing that a lot of what is hard for women and girls leading in this movement is largely invisible, right? But remembering, whether you're seeing it or not, that running against the grain of established and male-dominated leadership in the climate movement and beyond can be uncomfortable. It is certainly exhausting. It can be traumatic. I had a wonderful opportunity this summer to lead a retreat of 30 women climate leaders based in the US. And the sheer sort of burnout and trauma is very, very real. So I think the need for, yes, throwing our support behind particularly feminist leadership in this movement, with money, with platforms, with amplification, but also with care, right? And recognizing that to be on the front lines of this means you're taking a lot of pretty toxic emotional hits.
So we have to really combine our forces to be a strong support to the female leaders stepping out into the front line. Could more men as activists generate more climate activists in the everyday? I mean, agents of change. We see some men stepping up to the plate. Schwarzenegger, Leonardo DiCaprio. I'm sure you met some of them, Jakob. What impact could that have if we have more men stepping up as climate activists?
I mean, all of these problems are actually men's problems to solve. Like it's like when you're talking about rape, that's not an issue that women can solve. That's an issue that men can solve. And we understand that when it comes to other kinds of crimes, but and the same thing here. You know, the horrible online culture against female leaders is something that comes from men, and you know, and it of course are now propagated from the very top of some countries also.
For sure.
But it's up to us to work against that. It's up to us to make sure that women are heard and not interrupt women, not talk over them, and like basically, if I may say, shut up and listen. That's what men needs to do, and then work to fix the problems. And if we have colleagues that are talking over women or belittling women, we have to step in and say, you can't do this anymore.
Thank you, Jakob. Thank you. Nick, please.
I think this sort of, you know, are men acting or not acting? I mean, we obviously know huge numbers of men all around the world are acting on climate change at all kinds of different levels of society. I think that's to perhaps lose sight of what we're actually talking about. We're actually saying that if we can have more women in positions of power, a greater balance between men and women, a kind of equal balance, that we may harvest many, many, many more benefits. So I just saw a message from Bill Peduto, the mayor of Pittsburgh, yesterday about climate change. We had Jerry Brown in California. You've got Garcetti in Los Angeles, and there's lots of people that are worth admiring on the male side. But I think to characterize it that way is probably to lose sight of what we're actually trying to talk about and maybe realize in the world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Nick. Before I give you the word, Anne-Birgitte, I'd like to ask all of you, which female climate activist would you like to just put forward first, and also what aspects of this person's personality and work do you find so helpful and so strong? Would you like to start, Katharine?
Sure. It's a hard question in the sense that I think a lot of the women who are doing really remarkable work in this space sort of don't want to be called out as individual players. They really want to be seen sort of in the organizations, communities, and movements that they are a part of. But I certainly have been really blown away by many of the women who are leading the work on the Green New Deal in the US, both from a movement perspective, a kind of grassroots building perspective, but also from a policy perspective. And I think Rihanna Gunn-Wright, Varshini Prakash, so many incredible folks, but really putting this emphasis on centering justice and inclusion and frontline communities, not just because that's the right thing to do, it is also the more effective thing to do. And simply refusing to kind of buy into this ridiculous notion that somehow equity is secondary to survival, and that equity, in fact, is survival, right? And I think this moral clarity combined with rigor about meeting what the science says we have to do is just incredibly powerful and such an important evolution in the movement.
Anne-Birgitte, who would you like to put forward?
I'd like to put Katharine forward. I think she's certainly my hero when it comes to truly articulating the intersection between climate justice, gender justice, and the equality debate as she's just done so powerfully. The other person that popped into my mind, and that's probably a generational thing, is one of the first big climate activists for me was Gro Harlem Brundtland, the Norwegian Prime Minister, who was one of the first female prime ministers in the world, and who put sustainable development on the global agenda way before the world was
1987 already.
Yeah, so she was for me one of the first women that framed the agenda, and she also knew, she helped, I think, all of us learn a core lesson, and that is back to this conversation about, is it men, is it women? Everybody that's fighting for social justice, everybody who's fighting for the kind of transformation that climate action requires or gender justice requires, needs allies. So women can't do this alone. I mean, it is absolutely impossible to change those societal barriers and constructs on your own. So yes, we need more men. This is for sure not a feminist fight or a women's fight alone. But think of it, I think, if we can, as we see more young women step up, maybe we can also find more young men or adult men that say, hey, let's try and remove some of these barriers.
Great.
Let's try and make sure that we hear their voices and we step aside now and again and let them speak.
Thank you. Jakob and Nick, before we close this section, who would you like to put forward?
Well,
and why?
I feel like someone should say something about Greta Thunberg, but I think the most important thing about that is that she goes to a very a very basic part of this, and that is that it's science. And we have, the way that we're approaching sustainability is that it's actually just something that you have to do if the equation has to move along, if you have to solve the equation of living this many people on the planet. And I think that, of course, we're emotionally engaged in all of these things, but I always get excited when you get numbers that says that more female leaders means that companies are more profitable. For example, you can get those hard numbers. You look at what the scientists are saying about sustainability and the food supply, etc. We can really put it down into equations. Then we can eliminate a lot of noise around it, and a lot of people who is like, well, this is just, some people think this and some people think this, and women are too emotional, and like so much stupid things that comes out. Because if it's emotional to care about the future of the human race, then we should all be emotional.
Of course. Thank you, Jakob. Nick, you get to conclude this.
Yeah. I tried to meet Greta several times, but it never seems to happen. So maybe that's just a pipe dream that will never occur. But I'd love to meet Greta, yeah. I think Anne Hidalgo of Paris is unbelievable in the city movements. The long, sadly gone now, Wangari Maathai from Kenya, I met her several times, and she won the Nobel Peace Prize. She was unbelievable. And you know what? The best speech I ever saw delivered at the United Nations, without even looking at her script, was a woman who is extremely controversial, made the most amazing speech on climate change in the late 80s, and that was Margaret Thatcher. Wow. And if you see that video of Margaret Thatcher presenting to the United Nations in the late 80s, she's got a few things wrong because of the time. But it's like an hour's speech. It's totally riveting. She was a lawyer, but her first degree was in chemistry. And she understood, like Merkel did in Germany, being a scientist as well, she understood what we were putting at risk from climate change.
Thank you, Nick, with this unexpected woman putting her...
Controversial in other ways, Margaret Thatcher, but that speech that you had on climate change...
We'll have to look that up.
...is the winner, yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing your insights and your thoughts, Katharine, Anne-Birgitte, and Nick, and of course Jakob here in the studio. And let's just agree that eliminate the whatever is standing in front of these young women and other women, and just make more men come on board and show the numbers of what the benefits are of this great transition that we're seeing into more female leadership. All right. Thanks so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's now check out this episode's call to action.
My name is Nuttall and I'm from Pune, India. I will start with a question. What is that one single change that can be a solution to the current climate crisis? A new economic model. My campaign is to nominate Kate Raworth for a Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences for giving to the world an alternate economic model which ensures that all human needs are met within the resources of the planetary boundaries. This model is called donut economics. Why donut? Because in one single diagram with a donut shape in the center, Kate Raworth has brilliantly captured this entire concept of tracking a country's progress towards meeting the basic human needs and also the ecological ceiling that we must not cross if we have to keep our planet safe. So let's take a step back and look at our current economic model, which was invented way back in 1930s. This is based on GDP, gross domestic product. This concept has been blatantly exploited to make everyone believe that solution to all problems lies in more growth. It is a well-established fact that this legacy system of measuring a nation's progress through GDP growth is flawed and has resulted in plundering of our planet. At this juncture, when we are being faced with impacts of climate change, the time has come for nations to adopt this new economic model, which guides economists and policymakers to meet the aspirations of their citizens without harming the earth. In words of Kate Raworth, donut Economics is the compass for humanity in the 21st century. This remarkable new economic model is a gift to mankind and can transform our world and lead us to a balanced human and ecological coexistence. For this immense contribution in the field of economics, Kate Raworth deserves a Nobel Prize.
Hi, my name is Ingrid Hesser and I am head of marketing in continental Europe for Cognizant. I want to shed light and give climate love to Dagens Industri, this main Swedish business magazine. They have decided to give climate indicators on the stock market pages. And by doing this, they both show progress the companies are doing and also helping investors make their more sustainable choices. So let's give climate love to Dagens Industri and let's push for others to do the same. Let's make it a norm.
Hey, I'm Samuel and I work as a system developer at We Don't Have Time. I'm also a hacker who wants to use my skills to fight the climate crisis, and recently I've been meeting up with other hackers who want to do the same. So we've started exploring creative ideas where we can use our skills. So if you are a hacker like me, please join our community. We really need more people like you. And if you're interested, go to agree.earth/climate-hack and pledge your interest. And also please leave a comment with your thoughts. So what's the next step? We're planning hackathons together with some interesting partners, more to be announced soon. But until then, remember that together we are the solution.
Thank you for watching the show and thank you all guests for participating. The next episode will be broadcasted on December 18th and the theme is food production. Please subscribe to the We Don't Have Time YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any updates. And also download the social media app We Don't Have Time if you haven't done so already, where you can chat with our guests tonight. The chat is open until 8:30 Central European Standard Time. Until next show, please remember, we don't have time to wait, but we still have time to act.